after you and the coroner had gone, I found the bullet for which we had searched unsuccessfully, and from that hour to this I have known, what before I had suspected, that this dainty little weapon of Mr. Mainwaring's played no part in the shooting. Here is the bullet. You can see for yourself." Mr. Whitney gazed in silent astonishment as the detective compared the bullet with the two weapons, showing conclusively that it could never have been discharged from the familiar .32 caliber revolver. "Well, I'll be blessed if I can see what in the dickens that revolver of Mainwaring's had to do with the affair, anyway." "Very easily explained when you take into consideration the fact that the whole thing was an elaborately arranged plan on the part of the murderer to give the affair an appearance of suicide. One glance at the murdered man convinced me that the wound had never been produced by the weapon lying at his side. That clue led to others, and when I left that room with you to attend the inquest, I knew that Hugh Mainwaring had been shot with a .38 caliber revolver in his library near the center of the room, and that the body had afterwards been so arranged in the tower room as to give the appearance of his having deliberately shot himself beside his desk and with his own revolver. "By George, I believe you're right," said the attorney, "and I recall now your statement that day that the shooting had occurred in the library. I wondered then what reason you had for such an opinion." "A small stain on the library carpet and the bullet told me that much. Another thing, which at first puzzled me, was the marked absence of blood stains. There was a small pool of blood underneath the head, a slight stain on the carpet in the adjoining room, but none on the clothing or elsewhere. The solution to this I found on further investigation. The wound had been firmly and skillfully bandaged by an expert hand, the imprint of the bandage being plainly visible in the hair on the temples. Here is the proof that I was correct," and Merrick held up to the attorney's astonished view the stained and knotted handkerchief. "This, with the private keys belonging to Mr. Mainwaring's library, was in that box at the bottom of the lake. Do you consider Mrs. LaGrange or Hobson capable of planning and carrying out an affair so adroitly as that?" "You've got me floored," the attorney answered, gazing at the proofs before him. "Hobson I know nothing about, but that woman I believe could scheme to beat the very devil himself, and yet, Merrick, when you think of it, it must have taken time, considerable time, to plan a thing like that." "Or else," Merrick suggested, "it was the performance of an expert criminal. No bungling, no work of a green hand." Mr. Whitney stared slightly, but the detective continued. "Another point. Hobson, as you say, was the one man whom Hugh Mainwaring feared, and who evidently had some hold upon him. Would he then have dared denounce him as a liar and an impostor? Would not his use of such terms imply that he was addressing one whom he considered a stranger and unacquainted with the facts in the case?" "I see," the attorney replied quickly. "You have in mind Hobson's accomplice, the tall man with the dark glasses." Merrick smiled. "You are then inclined to the opinion that J. Henry Carruthers, who called in the afternoon, is identical with the so-called Jack Carroll who accompanied Hobson in the evening?" "Certainly that is a reasonable supposition. The descriptions of the two men agree remarkably, and the darky was positive, both in his testimony at the inquest and in conversation with me, that they were one and the same person." "Their general appearance seems to have been much the same, but their conduct and actions were totally unlike. Carruthers acted fearlessly, with no attempt at concealment, while, if you stop to think of it, of all the witnesses who tried to give a description of Carroll, not one had seen his face. He always remained in the background, as much concealed as possible." "I don't deny that you are correct," the attorney said musingly, "and they may have been two distinct individuals, Carroll evidently being the guilty party, but even in that event, in my opinion, he was only carrying out with a skillful hand the plans already arranged by that woman and Hobson." "Whatever part Carroll took in the affair, he was undoubtedly Hobson's agent, and you will find that Hobson and Mrs. LaGrange have been more intimately associated and for a much longer time than you suspect," and Merrick repeated what he had overheard of the interview in Mrs. LaGrange's parlor just after the close of the inquest. Mr. Whitney listened with deep interest. "Well, well! And you heard her accuse him of being an accessory? Of course she referred to the murder. By George, I should have wanted them arrested on the spot." After a slight pause, he continued, "There's one thing, Merrick, in the conduct of Carruthers which I don't understand. Why, after telling the secretary that he would remain at the Arlington for the next 2 or 3 days, should he return to the city the next morning on the 3:10 train?" "He seems to have been an impulsive man, who acted on the spur of the moment," Merrick answered. "But the strangest part of that is that he did not return to the city at all. He bought a ticket for New York, but the conductor informs me there was no such man on board, while the northbound train, which pulls out about 5 minutes later, had a passenger answering exactly to his description. The conductor on the latter train also informed me that, just as they were pulling out of the station, a man, tall and dark, rather good-looking, he should judge, though he could not see his face, and wearing a long, light overcoat, sprang aboard, decidedly winded, as though from running, and immediately steered for the darkest corner of the smoking car, where he sat with his hat well drawn down over his face. "Carroll again, by George!" exclaimed the attorney. "Here is a problem for you to solve," Merrick continued, pointing to the revolver and box lying side by side. "You think Brown threw those in the lake. Who was the man that Brown saw standing beside the lake just before 3 o'clock in the morning, and what was he doing? He was tall and dark, and wore a long coat or ulster. Was that Carroll or Carruthers? Did he throw anything into the lake, and if so, what?" Mr. Whitney gazed dubiously at the detective for a moment, then began to whistle softly, while he slowly shook his head. "No, Merrick, you've got me there. I never have had enough experience in this line that I could go into the detail work. I have to be guided by the main points in the case. Then again, I gave Brown's testimony very little thought, as I considered him unreliable and irresponsible." "Well, to come back to the main points, then. What reasons have you for connecting Mrs. LaGrange and Hobson with this affair that might not apply equally well in the cases of certain other people?" "What reason? Why, man alive, there is every reason to consider Mrs. LaGrange the instigator of the whole affair. In the first place, her one object and aim for the past 17 or 18 years has been to get hold of Hugh Mainwaring's property, to secure for herself and her son what she calls their rights." "That is the point," Merrick interrupted. "You consider her guilty because she would be interested in securing a hold upon the property, although she, personally, has no claim whatever. Has it never occurred to you that there might be others more deeply interested than she, inasmuch as they have valid claims, being the rightful heirs?" "I never thought of such a possibility," said the astonished attorney, "and I don't know that I understand now to whom you refer." "I have learned, from various reliable sources," the detective replied, "that Ralph Mainwaring has a younger brother, Harold, who is as much of a money lover as himself, though too indolent to take the same measures for acquiring it. He is a reckless, unprincipled fellow, and having about run through his own property, I understand, he had great expectations regarding this American estate, depending upon his share of the same to retrieve his wasted fortune. I learned yesterday by cable that since the departure of Ralph Mainwaring and his family for this country, his brother has been missing, and it is supposed among his associates in London that he took the next steamer for America, intending to assert his own claims." "And you think?" the attorney interrupted breathlessly, but Merrick shook his head and continued. "I have also, in the course of my investigations, incidentally discovered Hugh Mainwaring's secret, and, consequently, Hobson's secret, only that I know the real facts in the case, which Hobson does not know. You, as Mainwaring's friend, will not care to learn the details, and I shall not speak of them now, but I will say this much. There are probably in existence today, and perhaps not very far distant, heirs to this property, having a claim preceding not only that of Ralph Mainwaring or his son, but of Hugh Mainwaring himself." There was a silence for a few moments as the detective paused, Mr. Whitney's surprise rendering him speechless. At last he said, "Well, you are a truthful fellow, Merrick, and you never jump at conclusions, so I know your statements can be relied upon, but I'll be blessed if I understand how or when you have gathered all this information together. I suppose it would be useless to ask your deductions from all this, but I wish you would answer one or two questions. Do you think that this Harold Mainwaring, or those possible heirs you mention, would put in an appearance personally, or that they would work through agents and emissaries?" "Depends altogether upon circumstances. Harold Mainwaring would not be likely to appear on the scene unless he were pretty effectually disguised. As to the others, if they were to assert their claim, it would be difficult to say just what course they might take. I have made these statements merely to give you a hint of the possibilities involved in the case. It is now getting rather late, but I will give you one or two pointers to ruminate upon. Don't think that Hobson will run any risk or put himself to any personal inconvenience for Mrs. LaGrange. He is working, first and foremost, for Richard Hobson, after that for whoever will pay him best. Another thing, don't ever for a moment imagine that Hugh Mainwaring's private secretary is looking for a job. It's my opinion he'll give you fellows one of the hardest jobs you ever tackled, and unless I'm greatly mistaken, he's got brains enough and backing enough to carry through whatever he undertakes." "Say, I don't know as I exactly catch your meaning, but that's one thing I wanted to ask you. What do you think of that young man, anyway? I can't make him out." I noticed